Hello. Today, I'm going to give a lecture on meaning in architectural form, part 3. This is lecture L-T6. Well, we will concentrate today on the principles and concepts behind precedents, critical thinking, and focusing on vernacular architecture examples, the context of traditional architecture by non-architects. References to the vernacular. Definition of vernacular architecture is architecture characterized by the use of local materials and knowledge, usually without the supervision of professional architects. Vernacular architecture represents the majority of buildings and settlements created in pre-industrial societies and includes a very wide range of buildings, building traditions, and methods of construction. When we think about vernacular architecture and non-architects, we're talking about the craftsmen and the workers and those who build buildings such as this type of shop houses that is commonly found in Malaysia and in the Southeast Asian region in urban centers. In fact, this type came from South China with the artisans and craftsmen who created many of the ubiquitous nature of the towns, the settlements in Peninsular Malaysia in particular, and also in Sabah and Sarawak. Now, usually in town centers and town areas, because this type has the function, often the function of commercial function at the ground level. There are, of course, some which is a townhouse, which means that the ground level is also the house part, which may be the more formal ones, the more formal rooms, the private rooms upstairs. But often we find them as a shop house rather than just a townhouse. The characteristics, because when the British gave the guidelines in law how to build this based on the street frontage, the 5-foot way, and then the front hall and the rest of it. And they determined later that it should be made out of concrete and brick. And only timber is used additionally, not as the main material because of fire safety regulations. And that there is a party wall between each shop house so that the fire won't spread to the other part, the other shop houses in that area. And also the introduction of air well and into the middle so that there is ventilation. And these shop houses, if you manage to stay in them or live in them, even for a while, you recognize certain characteristics that just the natural elements are very close to you. When it rains, you can feel it very close to you. And yeah, so this is an example of vernacular architecture, and about 1,000 shop houses and townhouses is found in Georgetown, Penang alone, which are classified as having heritage characteristics. Now, this not only found in Malaysia, it's found in Southeast Asia, and in the right you have examples from Singapore and also Indonesia. So from Tajudin article below, on the top left is Rumah Limas with an anjong, it's like a balcony. The main house and the kitchen house at Kampong Java Road. And top right is 6 compound houses with surung and kitchen house. Compare with plans of Indie style houses in figure 9. So compound houses are type houses that mostly found in Georgetown, Penang. There are a few actually of this sort of houses, but not commonly found. So these are some of the housing types, not so mostly just shop houses in the urban areas. In the rural area, we'll discuss that later. So this is an interesting article that you can read about compound houses and how the setup is different. The setup here is different, even though it's more recognizable that this is in urban areas and compared to shop houses. And why in Malaysia we don't have that many shop houses. Maybe it has to do with the culture as well, the people living it and what they want. So we'll go to the next one. Much of the learning that we have in this slide comes from looking at patterns and the unself-conscious tradition. So when we look at the shop houses, for example, earlier, the craftsmen already know what to do. They have a template of what to do that they learned from previous craftsmen, older craftsmen, and what they learned, the tools and the trades and the materials is quite similar. Maybe from South China, it has a bit of difference in Peninsular Malaysia, but the pattern is almost the same. The same as this. It's also built by craftsmen. So it's unself-conscious tradition. There is no like an architect's name to it, but more of craftsman built, yeah, or tradesmen. So when we talk about vernacular architecture, you can refer to, in the 1800s, there was a writing by Gottfried Semper, which is a German, called The Four Elements of Architecture, and he identified the Trinidadian hut, Trinidad near the Caribbean. So this is a hut commonly found there. As you can see, there are similar materials or similar sort of patterns, but not really. But what he commonly found there is that these are the things that he's looking for in terms of the proportion system of the house. If you want to refer to the diagramming big idea methods of architecture composition by Swisher, he mentioned about Gottfried Semper's focus on the hearth, the mound, the roof, and the partition. The hearth is where there's the fire being built, right in the middle. The mound is when it's elevated. The vernacular building is elevated on a mound. And then we talk about the roof. We have to have the roof for shelter and the partition. And these are the basic idea of vernacular architecture in which Semper underlined. And that what he argued was even in architecture exploration of any architecture exploration, you have this basic criteria. Is it so in the Malay house? I refer a lot to Lim Ji Yuan's book, Rediscovering Malaysia's Indigenous Shelter System. We have we don't have the mound, but we have raised the level where the people is living or sleeping on is raised. So in a way we have a mound. And where is the hearth? The hearth should be where it's preparing food at the back. And then we have partitions, of course, screens that separate the different rooms. And then we have the roof. So it's typical of vernacular architecture to have those elements throughout the whole world. But we differ from the Trinidadian hut. The diagram here shows some common activities in the Malay house. Traditionally, spaces in the Malay house are multifunctional. The use of space changes at different times of the day and year. And there are minimal partitions or interior walls in the house. allowing for the flexible use of space and for good ventilation and lighting of the interiors. Minimal furniture is used, and most activities are done on the floor. You sit on the floor, you do have sometimes a bed, or later they will have sofas, settees, and all that, but the traditional way is to sit on the floor on a mat, on a woven mat, and do a lot of activities on the floor. However, look at this diagram on the right. You have the anjong, which is like a veranda or a porch or a balcony, but the entrance balcony, or in front, and then you have sarambi gantong, which is the secondary space before you go to the main space, which is called the rumah ibu. So rumah ibu is translated literally as mother house, but not necessarily the women folk occupy much of the space, but in terms of the family, they do. But when there are visitors, then this is the men folks space where they need a bigger space. But they can also have a discussion in the secondary space or the sort of corridor called Sarambi Ganto. And there is something like a crossover space called Salang. After the Rumah Ibu and going towards Rumah Tengah, which is the dining area for usually the family would just eat there, rather than, if there are visitors, they'll bring the food over to the Rumah Ibu. And none of the visitors will go to Rumah Tengah, which is next to the kitchen. So this is like a typical diagram for most of the houses. Interesting to note that the patterns of the is being how it started with the Rumah Ibu, the main house, and then added Serambi Gantong on the right side. And then you have other additions, like the salang or the crossover that links to the other space, like the Rumah Tengah. You can see the development of these spaces as time goes on, when it's like a modular system, but by craftsmen and non-architects. They've already got the template. They know how to do that, how to add the houses. And this lasts for years and years when maintained. So on the left are the different designs based on different regions in the Malay Peninsula. We focus on the Malay Peninsula at this instance because of the references that I have. But in Thailand, in other Southeast Asian countries in particular, with similar characteristics, you can find similar traditional vernacular houses that are made of timber. When you saw the Trinidadian house as well, it's also made of timber or made of the local materials. They could use clay or stuff like that as well as timber, but often the roof is made out of indigenous materials. So I'm going to go quickly into the others and show the climatic design of the Malay houses. Now you can see that the salang or the Serambi Gantong on the right hand side and the main house, they're all there's cross ventilation possible because of the it's from the floor to the ceiling or almost to the ceiling, where you can open and let in fresh air and cross ventilation. So these are the principles. Lightweight construction using low thermal capacity materials keeps house cool. Stilted house catches winds of higher velocity. Open interior spaces with minimal partitions allow good ventilation in the house. Large roof eaves for effective sun shading. Fully openable windows allow ventilation at body level. And even the roof, it has its system to ventilate the roof so that the heat that you gain from the roof does not dissipate into the interior space. So there are ventilation through roof joints. And the atap roofing of low thermal capacity gives Good insulation against heat. Ventilated roof space helps to cool the house. As you can see, why the design is very practical, functional, and with purpose at all parts of it, the joints, every single material, construction, and space. More examples of the Surumbi Gantung was found on the left, and the Rumah Ibu, the diagram below, and other parts like the courtyard. The introduction of the courtyard in certain places in the Malay Peninsula allow people to come through the selang to the courtyard, and then the houses are separated by the courtyard. So this is the introduction of courtyard from China to Malaysia or Malay Peninsula in particular. You can see that and found in certain places like in Malacca. At the bottom, in the middle, on the left, another example of house of antique dealer in Trenggalek, Malacca. So when you see this courtyard area, you can see that the house, the other house, and the place where people will sit near the entrance to the courtyard, as in this picture on the right. So it makes for the usefulness and the sense of privacy, hierarchy of spaces that is being used in terms of the use, in terms of the formal use, in terms of the less formal use, informal use. What activity is it that they're going to do? Is it family eating together? Is it doing a commercial activity, like maybe doing something to sell or cooking, or there is a festival coming up, so you can accommodate more people to assist and it spill over to the courtyard. So these spaces are very multifunctional and very flexible. There's some more examples here of Malaccan houses and the complexities of the house type that is developed over time, illustrated in this book. Now we look at the ornamentation, and clearly in the Muslim household, less ornamentation on figures and more on floral patterns, and using the local material, wood in particular, and influences of traditions before, and also a very contextual way of looking at it. The patterns represent what is available, what is inspired from the landscape or the natural surroundings in this region. So whatever it is, it could be a screen, it could be balustrading, it could be a door, it could be a window. So these are some of the traditional crafts using use of timber. The use of timber is shown throughout, right up to the roof construction from the base. Usually the base is, they start to use steel, for example, steel rods. The base is usually concrete, some form of stone or some form of mixed in concrete or use of such materials so that termites don't get into them. But they always have this like a layer or a metal layer so that termites don't go into the house. So these are all in Malay, you know, the beam, and tiang is column, tupai is like a bracket, and then rasuk pendek is like a beam. So these are the names for it, and rafters. Rabong is a ridge. Tunjuk langit is the post that goes up vertically. And they have specific names, like the rafters are kasau and beams are the alang. And you have the tebalaya at the side, which is actually a decorative sunrise pattern at the side on top of the roof, which also allow ventilation to come in. again, the diagram, and it's worth your while to look at these principles, cross ventilation, for example, the elongate. Okay, this is sorry, this is the what do you call it, comparison between a modern house on the right and the traditional house. When it comes to cross ventilation, the elongated open plans of the traditional Malay house allow easy passage of air and good cross ventilation. You have window at both sides. There are minimal interior partitions in the Malay house which restrict air movement in the house. But if you were to look at terrace houses, there are partitions inside, and you can't have proper cross ventilation, for example. And the wind velocity, where on stilts, it helps to create the velocity of wind increases with altitude, so you get much cooler when it's on stilts. That's what it says. When you're lower, it's not so cool. Ventilation of the body level, the openings are at the entire body level, and which part of the body need to be cooled is basically the upper body. So in the argument is in terrace houses, when you're sitting down, you can't get proper ventilation. And orientation. It just happens so the traditional Malay houses are often oriented to face Mecca in an east-west direction for religious reason, and the east-west orientation minimizes areas exposed to solar radiation, yeah? Because the bigger area exposed is the north and the south, which is not directly affected by the sun beating down on it. So for the housing estate houses, they disregard orientation. So that's why when you deal with designs, traditional architecture and vernacular architecture, you can get a lot of practical tips on how to orientate, how to make openings, the use of material. And you can innovate using screens made of concrete and bricks, which is quite fancy nowadays, or a trend. But in retrospect, you need to look at the principles of these traditional timber houses, because they give a lot of ideas on how to design in a tropical climate. The building materials. Traditional Malay houses use lightweight construction of wood and other natural materials. The lightweight construction of low thermal capacity holds little heat and cools adequately at night. The atap is just like a roof made out of leaves from the palm fronds. Is an excellent thermal insulator. Glazed areas are seldom found in traditional Malay houses. But the modern housing estate houses use bricks, tiles, concrete, and other materials of high thermal capacity. These materials store up heat and re-radiate it into the house, causing considerable discomfort. So even at night, when you find there is no sun, but because of the re-radiation, you can still feel hot in the house. So, and also in terrace houses, glazed areas are usually abundant in these houses. The layout, the ventilation of the roof spaces, and the vegetation also influence how cooling the house would be. The overhangs and exposed vertical areas, the glare, and the lighting level. So here are some of the sketches, drawings of the Tebalaya on the left. You can see a lot of designs and how they are staggered sometimes to allow in ventilation to the across underneath the roof to the other side with similar pattern on the other side. And some are done so that it's like a screen so that it can be well ventilated. So some of the materials I mentioned, like the nipa fronds on top of the atap. One thing about the traditional vernacular architecture, you would think that the siting, when we talk about vernacular architecture, this is a form and a design that has been a template for the artisans to work on. Whenever you have a house, they design it like this, and it's a practical design, and often it's found in rural area. If it's found in the cities, usually it is made of brick, because like I said earlier, I showed you the shop houses and the compound houses. Yeah, because in cities they are more regulated, but in rural area you have them there's more freedom to place whatever thing. So but often the principle is that these houses occupy some on top of some land which has other things in them, like a home garden, like palm fronds or other vegetation, and also a well in the outdoor area, and even toilet outdoors. So when you think about these houses, you not only think about the interior, you also think about the exterior, where underneath the floor you have storage spaces for some of the things that they do. For example, they go and farm paddy and rice here, and animals can also live underneath there, like chickens and goats. So there is a whole ecosystem, a whole livelihood situation when you talk about traditional Malay house, and how has it evolved through time. So we have new architecture now, which could be veering on regionalist sentiments, regional architecture. In the case of Lok Wee's house, he uses timber and he uses a brickwork, and he tried to have cross ventilation as much as possible. Also on the left, architecture by Ng Sek San, use of concrete and use of brickwork as well. It's like almost artistic to do these things. But the main idea is for cross ventilation to happen, and louvers or timber louvers upstairs, as you can see there. In the case of the Safari Roof House by Kevin Marklow, which you can find in below, there is a critical architectural design. It is a bungalow, and the use of trying to use modern architecture or principles of architecture design in a house using concrete blocks, natural concrete blocks, and the interpretation of the principles that I mentioned, cross ventilation, overhangs, and so on. But this is the innovation that this house posed and been published in this link, is that there was there is a golf course next to it. So this the architect actually borrowed the view, and you can see on the bottom left, in the middle, the bottom right, next to the interior shot, taken from inside in the courtyard, looking out to the golf course. You can see using vertical elements of the trees at the courtyard, as if that there is an infinite view from the house, taking in the view of the golf course. The use of vegetation and where to place the ventilation blocks accordingly based on the orientation of the sun, which part of the wall will have more of the sun, so you cool down that wall with vegetation, and vegetation will grow on that part of the wall, for example. So a sketch by the architect on the left, and more sketches on the left. And the Safari Roof House was inspired by not Land Rover, but the four-wheel drive, which has a safari roof. So the safari roof tried to ventilate the roof, which also shelter the house, so that the roof is not hot and the rest of the house is not hot either. Yeah. So the use of volume to get in the to make sure that it's comfortable for the occupants is also used in this instance. So there you go with the last photograph, the last reference, examples and precedents of the traditional vernacular architecture shown by architects of recent time that is found in Malaysia. And there are many other architects, these are not the only ones, obviously, and how they interpret the vernacular architecture to modern architecture. There are still people using pitch roofs for their design. It's not a problem, or angled roof. So when you use a roof angle, how useful is that angle? In this case, it's 60 degrees angle. And then the lower one is about 30 degrees, so that the rain can easily be dissipated. If you use a very shallow or a gradual angle, the rain will need longer time to be disposed of. So some of these practicalities have been utilized by these other architects, like Gottfried in the angles that he used, and the eaves that that let the rainwater out, yeah, which is overhang eaves, which is not just short but long. And the safari house also use a lot of the eaves, but the angle of it is minimum. It's almost, it doesn't have an inclination, but it's a minimum inclination. Let's see, yeah, it's a very minimum inclination of about maybe 5 to 10 degrees. So that's the trendy one, yeah, in nowadays. So that is all for now on vernacular architecture, both traditional and modern.